Welcome, everyone, for this first panel of this year's First Sea Lord Sea Power Conference. My name is Alessio Patalano, and I'm a Professor of War and Strategy in East Asia at King's College London. I'm truly delighted to be talking with you and sharing the conversations of this distinguished panel about this very important topic, that is the protecting the economy in the 2020s. Victoria very kindly mentioned earlier on that yesterday we made a change to last year's format for the conference. We moved the Future Maritime Leaders Laboratory from the ending component of the conference to the beginning, because we thought that since we're talking today about things that will matter over the next 20 years, perhaps it was important to have an idea from those who will be leading in this sector in 10, 20 years first, so that we can try to inform with their thoughts our deliberations today. We had about 60 participants from different walks of life, from shipping industry, broader business, from academia, from different departments of government, as well as the military. It was a very robust conversation, and one of the things that struck me is that consistently across the different smaller groups that we put them to work to, they all shared a sense of nervousness about the late 2020s and certainly the 2030s. There was a sense that we are heading towards a more fractured world order. There was a sense that strategic contestation, political instability, and economic disruptions might become more of a common currency over the next few years. Look to the youth for optimism, I say. But still, the very important point also that emerged against all of this was the idea that globally, all of them, and not all of them were specifically from a naval or a maritime background, all of them did share an understanding that maritime connectivity, physical and digital, represents a fundamental pillar of the global order. And so today, in engaging with the question of the maritime order, forces us, invites us to actually think about, as you just said, Secretary General, about the governance and order dimension together with that projection of power. These are two dimensions that exist in the same space. They stand side by side. And when it comes to trade, that is one of the key intersections. When does the disruption of trade become also an opportunity to advance strategic goals? Now, this is a very important question, and I am delighted to say that I will not answer it because it's not my job. I have far more qualified persons than me to do that, which is great. So let me introduce you to the speakers, which I'm sure they're all very familiar to you, but just very briefly. Vice Admiral Andrew Burns is Fleet Commander, possibly the best placed person to answer this question about how we keep our trade routes safe. And first time I met Admiral Burns a few years ago, long before many others then jumped on that wagon, he told me that his fundamental belief was that the fleet needed to be ready to fight tonight. And in a contested world today, his words were very apt. Perhaps that wisdom comes from a very important set of experiences, commanding HMS Berkeley, Somerset, and Bulwark. He also is a graduate of RCDS, and like all great admirals, also has a master's from King's College London. And this is, I'm completely objective about it. To the admiral's right, Amelia Gould. Amelia is the managing director of Helsing, UK, very important sort of business reality that thinks deeply about the role of technology and how it's shaping the maritime world. And she does that with a considerable amount of experience. She was an engineering officer in the Royal Navy before she moved to BAE System, where she undertook a range of engineering roles, as well as chief of staff of the chief executive officer. I mean, he's a Wise Woman in Industry Award winner in 2017, and he's a chartered engineer. So I'm very much looking forward to her comments about this critical intersection between technology and how we keep our trade routes safe later. Last, but in my heart first, because as a dear colleague from King's College, there's lots of King's College going on in this panel. I apologize for that. But we're very good at what we do, so actually I don't apologize for that. David Morgan-Owen is a reader in history award at the Department of Defence Studies at King's College London, also one of the leading British historians engaging with matters of naval strategy in the run-up to World War I, and currently writing a book on strategy and in particular the role of sea power in the First World War. Someone who has an expertise that from an historical perspective is deeply relevant to today, because that period of time went from competition to contestation into open conflict. So his thoughts about how the past can help us guide us in reading the present and the future are going to be absolutely essential. That's for the introduction. Now, I will sit and be quiet for a while and just sort of move on to the conversational aspects of this. And I would start really with Admiral Burns. Admiral, with the Red Sea unfolding and the operations taking place, which I've seen the Royal Navy taking a really important role. What is your perspective on this connection, on how do we keep our trade routes open and safe? To what extent the Red Sea is something, where do we need to place it in the spectrum of the contestation that stands between peace and war?
Thanks, Alessio. So first of all, I think it would be too easy to get overly focused on what's going on in the Southern Red Sea. I do think we need to zoom out to start with and look at the overall global context that we're operating in. And let's start with Ukraine, because Ukraine is a war, although taking place largely on the landmass of Ukraine, is a war that's had global ramifications. And it seems to me that almost every one of those ramifications has a maritime dimension. But you can't disconnect that with what's going on in the Middle East either, nor can you disconnect it from what's going on in the Indo-Asia-Pacific region, because China is watching how the West responds to both Ukraine and the situation in the Middle East. And this interconnectedness is important because the UK economy is nested within a global economy. All these things are connected. And that's why the economy is so vulnerable, because there are 8 strategic choke points. They are now being held at risk to some degree. And that is really the context that we need to view this in. And this really strikes at the heart of why we have a Navy. The defence purpose is to defend the nation and help it prosper. So that word prosper is all about economic prosperity. And when you have competition, increasingly confrontation at sea, you are going to have economic competition and confrontation, because there is a global competition for the resources in and under the sea. And why is this important to the UK? Well, I think the facts speak for themselves, but are often lost in translation. So the fact that 95% of our trade goes by sea, 50% of our energy and food arrives by sea every single day, 33% of global trade was flowing through the Red Sea before the Houthi attacks. And so the global supply chains are vulnerable to this sort of activity, which is why the Navy has to take a role in defending those sea lines of communication. But it has to be coordinated with all the other levers of government as well. So I think it's important we play a role, but it's got to be integrated in a whole-of-government approach within a national strategy, recognising the vulnerability of our economy within a globalised system.
That's terrific. Thank you so much. I think there's 2 points that you highlighted right there, which are very important to bear in mind. One is this question of competition over access to resources, but also confrontation in which state and non-state groups are trying to take advantage of that dependency upon the sea, that fundamental role between maritime connectivity and prosperity to keep other states, other societies held hostage at gunpoint or drone point, as one would probably say. Which leads me nicely to my question for Amelia, because in all of this, of course, one of the challenges is, as connectivity grows and we grow more dependent upon this very interconnected wide world, but we all have finite resources. And so the first question really is, how does technology fit into this broader picture? How technology becomes an enabler for us to better deal with the type of challenges that underwrite this link between connectivity and prosperity in contemporary societies?
Thank you, and thank you for having me, because that question and also the diversity of this panel between someone leading the Navy, a historian, and someone working in technology shows how the Navy thinks and how we in the UK think that maritime power is about more than platforms. You know, that the reason why I'm here talking about technology is because we recognize, exactly as you've just said, about the interconnectivity and the ability to demonstrate, project maritime power. And we know about all the problems of trade defense. They've been talked about, and I'm not going to repeat them here, but one of the things I would like to reiterate, and for those who've heard yesterday, the Prime Minister's speech on security, where he said, he started with, I feel a profound sense of urgency. There will be more change in the next 5 years than there have been in the last 30. And that implies that maritime power has to be about more than just ships, because the next 5 years we cannot rely on new ships coming into service to deliver the things. So the hulls are no longer the differentiating factor to protecting trade defense. And therefore our potency and our ability to survive the kind of attacks you talk about in the Red Sea or the kind of threats we're facing are defined by the systems we put on the ships and on how we protect the seafarers, as discussed. And so I put to you that actually, and even though we're talking about 2040, that actually the future in this decade is software-defined and hardware-enabled. That it is about, and as we're seeing in Ukraine, and again, I won't repeat all the lessons, you know, drones have become the commodity. The bit that's defining the technology and the ability to strike is about the software that we put onto them. And then the other part is the Royal Navy in the UK has always been at the leading edge of applying new technology and embracing it, you know, first to adopt steam, radar, electricity. Again, the Prime Minister did say yesterday, AI is the new electricity. So it will be ubiquitous and it will be transformative. And just like when I joined the Navy, computers were first started going to sea. You know, my first platform was an ADORS ship, for those of you who remember that. And then I spent my time as a weapons engineer fitting computers to ships to enable those ships to be more effective. I'm here working for Helsing because I believe we're in that next generational transformation. And AI will provide the same transformation in the next 20 years that I've seen in my last 20 years in defense. So we talk a lot about a wise pivot. And I think the pivot that we're going to have in this decade will be around the data. You know, the platforms that we've got generate petabytes of data a second, and that will demand AI and software in order to generate it and to keep it ahead. So really, trade defense is about enabling sailors to fight the ship and not fight the data, I'd suggest. And therefore, it's really important that we embrace the right systems to enable them to make the right decisions to protect our routes, but also to be able to adapt. And I think the final point I'd leave you with is that it's very important, again, as we've seen in Ukraine, as we've seen in the Red Sea as the threat, it is no longer about designing ships that fit the threats we've faced in the past. It's about designing platforms and maritime power that is able to adapt as the threat changes in the timescales that we need to bridge that gap.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this. Software designed and hardware enabled. I love it. I'm probably going to plagiarize it, so stand fast. This is really important point because it nicely also allows me to look across the table and go towards David, because it strikes me that one of the key differences that we're looking at today, whereas in the 1920s and 30s we were very much concerned about the size of a ship and how we categorize them, and then on the back of that you would reverse engineer the type of systems you have on board. Right now, we're moving towards a very different kind of space in which it doesn't matter how big the hull is, because the key thing is going to be the systems that you put on it and how those systems enable the hardware to deliver effect in that sense. But so, again, David, coming to you, there's two things there that I find very interesting. There is a lot of contestation. Everybody recognizes that maritime connectivity stands at the heart of international order. But one could also argue that maritime connectivity has always been at the heart of the international order, certainly in modern times. So from your perspective, what are the main differences, or what are the sort of the main whispering coming out of history that we should sort of pay attention to these days?
Thanks, Alessio. It's a great pleasure to speak as the spokesperson for all of historical experience in the company of a great many people that know a lot about naval history. So please feel free to direct any complaints you have to the panel chair. I think naval history is a particularly bad fit for a kind of really binary or exaggerated dichotomy between peace and war. We can all think of numerous examples of power being exercised or violence being conducted at sea outside of periods that we would legally or nominally define in terms of warfare, whether that's competition against non-state actors, piracy, whether that's the role of neutral navies in periods where that country may not be engaged in a war itself, but armed neutrality is tremendously important. You might think about the Scandinavian countries in World War I, the United States Navy in 1941. But I think just because the distinction is not binary or dichotomous doesn't mean that it isn't necessary for us to be clear that these dynamics operate differently in times of peace than they do in times of war, even in the context of a high degree of contestation. And I think this goes back to, for a naval audience, I guess a Courbetian, or for a more general audience, perhaps a Clausewitzian insistence on the fact that war as a social and political phenomenon has a distinct nature of its own, and that those dynamics will inevitably differ from those in peace. And I think when it comes to the defence of trade, we can see this relatively clearly. So in times of peace, the role of navies in the defence of trade, I think, can easily be thought about in terms of policy choices on the one hand, do we need to do this? And then in terms of tactics or tasks on the other, how do we go about enacting this particular mission? In wartime, war's adversarial nature makes questions of strategy fundamentally much more important to these dynamics. And here, the defence of trade cannot be reduced to tactics or tasks because it has to be related to wider questions of, I suppose, what we might traditionally refer to as command of the sea or sea control. That competition for either securing or disputing the ability to use the sea that is going to require navies to concentrate or disperse in different ways at different times. And I think this kind of links, just to finish off, to the point that we've all kind of touched on at the end here about what this means for force structure, because you mentioned the point about the 1920s, but I suppose the debate you're discussing there is really about within the Navy itself. So if there is a single lesson from history that I think I don't feel tentative about advancing in this audience, is that no Navy will have all the things it wants to have at the outbreak of a war. Whether you are seeking to attack trade or seeking to defend it, it has always necessitated considerable thinking about how to rapidly expand one's maritime forces at the outbreak of war before the period in which you might be able to build a ship from scratch. So that, in the past, might look like using hulls that already exist, armed merchant auxiliaries, fitting systems or communications onto ships to enable them to perform these duties, or significant acts of industrial policy that might result in warships that are much less capable than those that we might launch in peacetime, but that are for fundamentally different roles.
And on behalf of all the military historians in the country, thank you very much for taking the task on finding the ultimate answers. Because I think it's very important what you say, this question between peace and war. And the key thing is that on the day something goes really bad, you are very likely not to have everything you need. But the question that becomes, how do you adapt? And how you scale up and you meet sort of the requirements of the challenge ahead. And I also thought it was very important, the point that you emphasized, that peacetime trade defense very much is about the politics and reading the politics of what is happening, whereas in wartime it's a much greater strategic endeavor because it is about that sea control that delivers the capacity to continue to fight. I want to get back, Amelia, to you on this particular point, because one of the questions that we're looking at in terms of trade defense and trade, keeping trade routes open and safe, as you said, this is an interconnected world. It is the maritime order is is a core component, is a pillar, as I said, of international stability and international order. That obviously invites a reflection about working with others, corporations, partnerships. And this is something else that I want to touch upon with you, because it seems to me one of the subtle critiques that we get these days, to a point that David mentioned, is that in face of a serious challenge, must become critical, but we're not necessarily engineered to have the necessary mass that we want to do. But on the other hand, we do have partners and allies and friends. So how do you see, in your space, from your perspective, the question of partnerships and allies and friends and how one should think about this in a way to meet these growing demands?
I think first of all, it's why we need to be a globally deployed Navy. And the Royal Navy has operated and engaged with half the nations of the world over the past year. And that is influencing others where malign actors might wish to have more of a role. It's across the full spectrum of operations from defence diplomacy to warfighting in the southern Red Sea. It's dealing with illegal and unregulated fishing with partners in the Indo-Asia-Pacific region. It's being available for disaster relief. And I think it's important that the flexibility of maritime power is recognised and we maintain that flexibility no matter what sort of force construct we view in the future, because I think all those tasks will remain for the Royal Navy to deliver in the future. But I do share this sort of sense of urgency and the need to adapt. And we've got to adapt and confront the sort of tactics that are now being used by the Houthis in the southern Red Sea, Russia and Ukraine in that war. And at the heart of this is how we collaborate with our partners and allies. And of course we have the advantage of being a member of NATO, a member of the Joint Expeditionary Force. We are the framework nation for that. That is complementary to NATO and a number of other international, bilateral, multilateral organisations in which we can play a part as a Navy. But those alliances are critical because they are not alliances that countries like Russia and China enjoy. And it is the only way we can deliver the mass in a warfighting sense that we'll need to deliver when that moment comes. I think what we've been involved with the Southern Red Sea, Operation Prosperity Guardian, is a good example of that. But the Royal Navy, of course, has had a permanent or near permanent presence in the Middle East for decades. And the difficulty for the Navy, of course, is that navies stop bad things happening. And it's difficult to prove that you've stopped bad things happening. But if you look at our presence around the world, that is certainly a case for what we have offered. But it is important we now move from routine interoperability with our partners and allies to genuine interchangeability. So we operate as we would wish to fight, because we have to deliver with our partners and allies a credible war-fighting effort when that moment comes.
Andrew, thank you so much. I'm very grateful for you to mention this question of the globally deployed Navy as a precondition, because that allows you visibility not only towards your partners, but all the environment, and therefore a better capacity to assess where risks, threats, challenges might come from. So that was a very important point. And also this question of shifting intellectually from a world of interoperability to a world of interchangeability, which of course demands a degree of broader political commitment for countries to be able to empower their military organizations to have that kind of proximity. And again, this links very nicely to the other points that you raised about the fact that if there's one advantage that those who stand behind the maritime order possess, is the fact that, contrary to those who are trying to upend it, they do have friends and allies, crucially. And that makes a significant difference if in a sort of, on a rainy day, you have to have that critical mass to be able to fight tonight, as you always put it. So thank you kindly for this. But it also nicely leads us to a question I wanted to ask to Amelia, because the question of partnership, you also mentioned it in your remarks in your first question. You talked about how the Royal Navy had been at the forefront of application of new technology. And it seems to me that when we talk about this, it would be unfair not to say, well then, therefore, looking ahead, that is also an opportunity in that context as well. Do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I agree, and I think the partnership Admiral Wood just talked about in terms of fighting together, protecting together, also extends into a partnership with industry and the broader maritime sector. And I'm not a naval historian, but again, that's one of the, scaling up in the Second World War, Spitfire production, even Ukraine using furniture factories to make drones. Industry are a critical part of preparing for conflict. And in terms of technology, the UK is a leading technology nation. We generate some of the best talent in AI, software, that sort of thing, through our fantastic university, academic institutions, startups. But sadly, they all end up working for US firms. I'm sorry for the Americans in the audience. So my call is to say that actually cooperation and partnerships with maritime power is just as key about the UK being proud of its technology heritage as well as its maritime heritage, and the opportunity to bring those two together to say, how do we project maritime power through our technology and the ability to export not just fantastic ship designs, as we've done in the last few years, but also the technology that enables those ships. And that interoperability and interchangeability isn't just about transmitting boxes from one ship to another or being able to swap one frigate for another nation's. It's also about understanding the technology that sits within and how that contributes to the whole force. You know, the UK is in a really privileged position that we can pivot both ways through partnerships we have within Europe, but also with the partnerships we have across the Atlantic, through AUKUS, that sort of thing. I can't think of any other European nation that has that intersection of a fantastic maritime industry, a fantastic tech industry, plus also the ability to project. So I'd say that maritime partnership should be about embracing all of that to project the power in a different way.
And this is very important, and I think you made a very important point in reference to AUKUS, because when we think about AUKUS, people rightly think first and foremost to Pillar 1 and the nuclear endeavour, but Pillar 2, to me, is also perhaps the even bigger deal in that story, because it's exactly as you said, when it comes to interchangeability, some of the advanced technology that figures within Pillar 2 stands at the heart of an opportunity to develop with close, trusted partners that sort of system integration, so that that interchangeability piece will be absolutely natural if and when it's required. So thank you very much for raising that. Which now leads me to ask David a slightly more intellectual question, if I may. Because what we talked about here, it seems to me, hey, you know, you are the gravitas of the story on the table. I'm just the butler, so you get the tough questions. Here, it seems to me that one of the things that perhaps is worth spending a moment on is what seem to be emerging two set of challenges to address. One is about how the role of defense in the Navy as part of that sort of trade defense business. But then there is also a question of resilience, which I think has to do more with not only societies, but also industry, and indeed the governance piece that was mentioned earlier on. How do we make the institution, in that sense, as well as those who operate at sea, those who are in the sort of merchant shipping community, more resilient in the face of these growing challenges? And so in that sense, perhaps, I wanted to ask you if you had any thoughts about how historically we can look back and think about as a way to inject a greater, if you want, capacity to deal with these challenges, thinking in terms of resilience and defense as a way to guide the different stakeholders in this picture.
Thanks, Alessio. So I suppose it goes back to Admiral Key's opening remarks, right? What is the role of naval power within sea power, more broadly? And I think it's fair to say that there are plentiful examples of history where how navies think about their role in this context, trade defense, the theme of what we're talking about today, is not necessarily completely the same as how people that work in what we would refer to as global logistics, but shipping or trade, see that problem. And how to manage the interaction between those two things is absolutely crucial, because for navies, it's massively important for them to be able to bridge that gap, but equally for those involved in the management of global logistics chains, it's very important for them to be able to understand why those naval dynamics might be coming from the place that they are, and how to create that harmony and consensus in a highly dynamic environment where in history it has frequently had to be improvised imperfectly and at speed is, I guess, a central challenge to think about. And as I understand it, this happens through something called the Shipping Defence Advisory Committee, I think, which is something that might kind of work for this. But I think that idea of resilience is a really helpful one to think about this, because in some respects, you could say that framing this conversation in terms of trade defence already gives it a very Navy-centric focus. And actually what we're really talking about here, you could see it in two different ways. It could be the defence of trade, or it could be the management or the resilience of a wartime economy. And there are certain steps that naval forces might wish to take to defend trade that might actually be deeply counterproductive for the purposes of managing shipping or trade in the context of a war economy. So you mentioned that I primarily work on the First World War. It took well into 1917 for the enemy forces to sink as many ships as the Army and Navy had requisitioned in the First World War. So the primary enemy of British shipping in the First World War, 3 years in, was the Admiralty, as far as the ship owners were concerned. And this is, it's a gratuitous example, but there's just completely different sets of perspectives and priority in that respect. And those tensions are multiple. They might occur in terms of managing maritime workforces. They might occur in terms of competing for industrial production or in very narrow supply lines, or in the use or potentially the destruction of key pieces of infrastructure as well. So I think how to balance those two competing priorities that can be harmonized, but it is very, very important. And maybe the final thing that I'll say is that I think oftentimes it's easy to hear the word resilience and think about it in quite national terms, but this discussion today really highlights the fact that national resilience is inherently international, networked, and dependent upon a whole load of variables that it's not within our ability solely to control. And being able to have that outward-facing understanding of the fact that, in a conflict with country X, that country's merchant marine might disappear from the global pool of tonnage. That's going to mean all sorts of second and third order knock-on effects for where trade goes, what that means for your navy. There's a lot of very complex problems that are highly international and require a great degree of cooperation in that space.
David, thank you so much for this last point, because I think it's absolutely crucial. People not realize the extent to which there is a genuine international conversation taking place. In January, I was fortunate enough to be at the Paris Naval Conference, and in October, I've been fortunate enough to visit Venice for the Italian Sea Power Conference. And in the past, I had the absolute honor to attend a number of conferences in Japan on maritime matters. This is an international conversation, and I think this is a very important point that is not sufficiently emphasized. We are in a different world compared to 100, 150 years ago, whereby you have a public, broader conversation that is specifically designed to be international and to bring people with similar concerns, but different approaches and resources to them together to try to harmonize and create synergies in the way they approach them. So that's a very important point.